which is a panel discussion. And one of the things that the folks who joined us in our October planning meeting said is it would be really helpful to hear from people who are kind of more on the resource side about how they think about well-being and flourishing, so that we can get a sense in our organization how we might approach these topics and so forth. So we've invited a stellar group of panel members to talk with us about these questions. What kinds of things are being done, are being looked at, what kinds of things aren't, how might we position the work that we're doing in terms of well-being, even if it's not that particular word. There are a lot of ways in which we can, arose by any other name. There are lots of names that we can refer to this as. So what I'm going to ask is please, if each panelist would just take a couple of minutes to introduce themselves, describe their organization and their role within it. I know we've heard a little bit from Nisha and Sunil already, but there may be people who've come in since then. So I'll just ask just a couple of minutes, just so we can get a kind of a sense, and then we'll have a bit of a dialogue amongst us, and then we'll open it up to questions from everybody else. Okay. All right, Chloe, take it away.
Hi, I'm Chloe Reison. I'm the Associate Director of the SACS Program for Arts Innovation, which is a program at Penn that is really a support system for the arts at the university. And our definition of the arts is expansive. We don't prioritize one art form over another, and we actually include within the umbrella of the arts also the humanities. Part of what I do is I manage a grants program that supports students, faculty, staff, departments, program centers, and also collaborations with partners outside of the university. And so we think a lot about the needs of our community and how we can meet them, and how the arts can both be supported at Penn and also a resource to the community. And so I'm really excited to be a part of this panel and to hear from the other panelists about how they think about the arts and well-being. I think we see them as linked. I think our support system is for the arts, but I think that we are always thinking about the notion of flourishing within that.
Great, thank you.
I'll be brief. My name is Nisha Sajnani, and most of you may have heard the presentation. For those who didn't, I co-direct the Jamil Arts and Health Lab, which is a lab formed in collaboration between NYU Steinhardt, where I'm an associate professor of the creative arts therapies, and the World Health Organization, Culture Runners and Community Jamil, with a mission to measurably improve lives through the arts and to scale interventions where there's good evidence. And within NYU, I also founded the Arts and Health at NYU, which is an ecosystem of 15 campuses that each have scholars within them that are interested in the arts and health. And so we cultivate opportunities for that work to come forward into curricular options and other options, research options.
Hi, everyone. I'm Kelly Shindler. I'm the Director of Exhibitions and Public Interpretation at the Pew Center for Arts and Heritage based here in Philadelphia. We are a regional grant maker. We support arts organizations and artists in the 5-county region here in the city and surrounding suburbs. And we support them through unrestricted artist fellowships. We give out 12 fellowships to artists a year in all disciplines. There's no disciplinary specificity there, so it's whatever comes our way is totally on the table, to project grants, which range from, we support small arts organizations that may be full-time staff of 1 to 1.5 people, all the way up to the art museum and some of the colleagues here in this room, many of whom we have long-term existing relationships with. We believe in a thriving cultural ecosystem here in the city and in the region, and that's what we're here to support. And thriving communities is certainly a pillar of the Pew's Greater Philadelphia program's key strategic priorities at this stage also going forward. So this is totally our language. It's very exciting to be here today, hearing from some of these amazing speakers, and I'm really excited to get into this conversation to kind of share a little bit more about our work and where our work might overlap.
Hi, I'm Sunil Iyengar, Director of the Office of Research and Analysis at the National Endowment for the Arts. I was very glad James used the term resourcing, not necessarily funding, although that is a big part of what we do, of course. But I think our chair has actually emphasized She would like the NEA to be known more as a national resource center, in addition to, of course, its mighty, small but mighty, our grant making capabilities across the nation. So yes, we do fund arts projects all around the country, but we do increasingly have an emphasis on health and well-being through the arts. But some of the work that's led to that has gone back several years and even a couple of decades on things like creative placemaking, where we support projects like Our Town, which are community wide projects around arts, culture, and design to advance some kind of community-wide outcome, often health. It's just as an example. But anyway, in research, we support studies, as I said earlier, typically based somehow on social and behavioral sciences or health, even, I mean, sometimes biomedical, even looking at the arts and various dimensions of the arts. And in fact, we have supported a lot of arts and health research, including this lab, which we're proud to do. Just quickly, we also do evaluation and strategic planning for the agency. So just another piece of what we do. I think that's all I'll say for now.
Terrific. Thanks to each of you for sharing that. I think my first question for you is going to be around language. And so I know in my role directing the Master of Applied Positive Psychology with students in business and education and medicine and law and other domains, sometimes the language of positive psychology or the positive is helpful. Sometimes it's not. And so part of what we talk about with our students is what is the appropriate language for the context in which you find yourself, right? So I guess my first question is, this conference is entitled Visual Arts for Flourishing. We've been talking a lot about well-being, thriving, so about health and so forth. So where you sit, what is language that you see would be helpful?
Or something,
Please.
Others feel free. I'm glad you asked that, because I think, as much as we increasingly have thankfully, a more multidisciplinary ethos, like we really want people to collaborate and bust silos. Same time, there's a tension, because to serve various constituencies and to try to be faithful to the school community of practice of that constituency, you often have to speak their language. You really have to learn their language, even as you try to get things across to another and truly collaborate. And I say that because even a little thing like, we talked about this many times, James, like it's a humanities flourishing project. And I think that's great. I mean, I see the arts all over that, but some people don't. They're like, oh, you have to have the word of the arts there, or vice versa. We just have the arts, and so why is that? And you go back and understand how things are funded, in the infrastructure and the community's practices have developed, whether in academia or outside. But then you multiply that issue with all the various disciplinary aspects of the arts or the various disciplinary aspects of health, and then take the divide between researchers and practitioners. It can be a little overwhelming sometimes. But I think that's why this effort of translation and doing it in a smart way is crucial. I will just throw out a plug also for arts education, because it's subsumed somehow in the arts, and there are definite literature and there's pedigree, if you will, of thought and lived experience in school and out of school arts education that might get under the radar when we talk about arts and health. And I think one of the things we could do is also bring educational researchers into the fold more deliberately. Thanks.
I'll jump in. I thank you for that. We think a lot about those same issues. Penn is a very large institution that is often challenged with being in sort of disciplinary silos, but there's also a lot of work that is happening across departments, across disciplines. And we think a lot about how our opportunities are being tailored to the needs of various community members and not isolating others. So how do you support various communities at the same time through without overwhelming them with opportunities? And so we think a lot about, with our various grant opportunities, how do we make them open, and how do we also make them specific? And I think that there's a challenge with this sort of where language comes into play too is in those sort of in those kind of boundaries, right? There's often kind of blurry boundaries between the arts and humanities or the arts and other disciplines or humanities and other disciplines. We've often been asked, what are the departments, program centers that are under the umbrella of the arts? And it's an impossible task, right? Because you could say, yes, the arts are happening here, here, and here, but they're also happening over here in the health system, and they're also happening over here in Department of, positive psychology and in philosophy, and so it's, we really shy away from saying this is where the arts are at Penn, because we really want to encourage them to be everywhere, and we really want to acknowledge where they are and try to support them where they are. So I think language and how you both in sort of how you acknowledge where the arts and humanities are and also how you support them where they are is really key.
I can jump in and piggyback off that too. I think at the Pew Center, we're spending a lot of time thinking about where organizations, artists, and practitioners are coming out of the pandemic. What does the post-pandemic landscape look like? What is the impact of that on the health and well-being of arts organizations, which are one of our primary constituencies, and also for individuals? And we know, I mean, there's data and research that shows that they are not well, that staffs are not well, that audiences and neighbors are not well. And so I think a lot of what the work that we're doing and thinking about is, and that we're seeing, has to do with how organizations are repositioning themselves at this time to be more welcoming to their communities, to be better neighbors, to think about access in new and different ways that are more inclusive, to really kind of dig down into their local, hyper local spaces and positions to make sure that they're relevant to their most immediate neighbors. I mean, I see a lot of that here with the organizations that we work with here at Penn, but certainly our work, goes beyond the campus. But, I think that's become this issue of how do you make your work meaningful to those that are in your immediate surroundings is really important to think about. And what language are you using that crafts kind of an open invitation of welcome or of engagement in some way, or create some sense of porousness or their shared decision-making around those opportunities.
Just speak briefly to the fact that, for the WHO side, I think they spent a lot of time, and, we and our collaboration spent time unpacking what do we mean by health. And so a lot of that discussion overlaps with how you have framed flourishing. And I heard it today. There's so much resonance there, which is when you and I were in Italy, we were talking about how there's a redefinition process, constantly ongoing. And this would be so wonderful to be able to bring this language in. And at the same time, of course, you're going to come up against challenges to that for the reasons that have already been mentioned in terms of how the investments that have already been made in the language that's there, the ways in which people define things for themselves, even though there are certainly shared definitions. So I'm thinking about that side, and I'm also thinking about how within the university environment, I also am on faculty at Stern, which is our business school. And so Stern is a part of that ecosystem of arts and health at NYU, but they really just don't talk about health. That's just not what they're talking about. So unless we're talking about investing in the healthcare space, then we'll talk about it. But otherwise, we're gonna use other language, and it's defined by the constituency involved. A group of artists that we're working with around a health ethics process, looking at what are the ethics of working in care contexts or in context of crises, what is needed to support artists working in these spaces. They wanted to shy away from health. They really focused on the word care, and that's where we landed. So I guess I think there's something being threaded here around the specificity of the people and places in which we're working.
Terrific, thank you. I know that when we first started this work, and Sarah can speak to this too, we were using the term well-being a lot, and oftentimes interchangeably with flourishing. And we had some colleagues in the humanities who wondered if we might not be missing a whole lot about the world. If we're just, about smiling and rainbows and butterflies and so forth. We have nothing against those things, but so my own language has evolved over the years. I've jokingly or not jokingly said to Sarah that, our biggest challenge is to make as small a target out of ourselves as we can when we use this language. Because sometimes people come with their own assumptions, their own perspectives and so forth. And so maybe there isn't any one single word that is going to capture everything. Maybe it's going to be using several words, knowing what the context is and so forth. And I think that part of what, to my mind, is the challenge and also the really deep excitement about this work is that each individual, each organization, each group, each department within a university, each organization in our culture has a role to play toward this larger flourishing, thriving, right? Well-being, flourishing is by everyone and for everyone.
Yeah, I think there's generally a movement. I mean, again, I think these things come in waves, but at least in government speak, a lot of the federal agencies are moving away or trying to acknowledge and own. They're trying to move away from a deficit-oriented perspective, which has been the norm for, we were talking about health indicators, somebody and I were talking about health indicators, and how they're often negative indicators versus. And so I think flourishing, thriving is kind of in that spirit and in the vein. I was also thinking of something, Mark was sharing about struggling, the term struggling clusters. He was talking about various disadvantaged versus, market clusters and various divisions. I used clusters 40 times like you did. But I think that's another thing. It's like, how do you characterize this quote disadvantaged communities and still acknowledge their latent strengths? And that's the struggling, that's a struggle, for a lot of us, in trying to get it right. There's certain terms that are used in government like underserved or this or that. And somehow it doesn't reflect the totality of experiences that we're trying to capture.
So let's pick up on that, Sunil, because I think that's a really important point. Again, it's one that we've been on the wrong side of or perceived to be on the wrong side of, where and I don't mean to be glib about it, because there's really a point here. If we say, hey, everybody, I got a great idea. Let's focus on happiness and flourishing and being great. And then somebody's like, yeah, but that's not where I'm at. We heard this morning from Tamara talking about trauma and trauma-informed kind of approaches. And so we can't merely say, well, flourishing is just about you on your best day. We can't, I think, go the other direction and say it's only about the deficit, right? Where a health indicator is really an illness indicator, right? So how do we talk about that balance in a way that isn't a double whammy? Because sometimes we impose our perspectives onto these marginalized or at risk or whatever we want to call them. We say, well, they can't be interested in flourishing. They're interested in just getting by. Well, maybe if we ask them, though, we might find out that relationships, meaning, all these things are actually of importance to them as well. So curious what the rest of you think about that balance of being able to talk about flourishing, also from the standpoint of acknowledging that not all of life is a gorgeous spring day.
We have it right in the language of the lab, and it's a tension point for me, the word underserved. So I don't have more to say on it right now, just that there's a tension there, definitely. In a lot of the global development language, there's a lot of tension. Who are we reaching? And so folks have settled on low and middle income countries, which is of course not a homogeneous entity. It really doesn't get at the disparities that exist in high income countries, for example. Yeah. Come back.
I mean, I think the language and that tension, one strategy that we've seen that has been really constructive is to approach working, in various communities with some humility and in a collaborative way. And by that, I mean, co-authorship models, advisory councils, advisory committees. I think Merrill Arts is really exemplary in this regard. Bringing in community members and advisors into design processes from the beginning, as opposed to coming in at the very end or when the project is live and out in the world. So having community formed design processes can be really impactful, curatorial processes that solicit community input, ways to make sure that those decision processes are porous and inclusive. There's an exhibition that's up right now at the University City Science Center, so right around the corner from here, called Futures Without Guns, which is looking at gun violence as a health equity issue. And certainly when the curators and organizers of that exhibition came to us with this as an idea, they understood the high stakes of the issue and that they had to enter into the conversation with a lot of humility and with a lot of curiosity and inquiry about how to approach this issue. So it wasn't, damaging or traumatizing to audiences that are directly impacted by this issue. So they had a years-long community engaged process to think about the questions that were raised by the exhibition, to think about artists and the artworks that were to be part of that project, and also to have a design process in which artists presented their work to the advisors so that there could be conversations ahead of time, and so that, everyone was informed along the way.
Love that.
Yeah, I just want to echo, I think the community in the research kind of analog, community-based participatory research is something we've really tried to sponsor and support as well. For part of these reasons that we want to not only to engage different types of people in the research processes, but to make sure the definitions are working definitions that are valid, have face validity and so forth. And I think that, I was thinking of that when you said the gun mural, we actually are funding a project, another research lab at around University of Michigan, but in the Detroit area, but they're doing in other cities where they're doing co-creation of murals. And this is a community-based participatory research project because they're actually involved in the study, the people designing the murals, community members, and the researchers are trying to understand what the potential impact is on reducing gun-related incidents among youth, because there's really great data they have that they can analyze, but they're also doing a lot of qualitative research. And so I think with your project, from what I understand, the general flourishing project, flourishing is in a sense a neutral word. I mean, it's directionally, it's something, like you said, the root of it is, no pun intended, is flowering, right? But you really need to have that informed, and I know you do, but whether it's semi-structured interviews, or find some ways to truly reflect on the community being for which we're saying flourishing, so that we're not imposing values on that.
I love that, and it connects to my mind to the work that was presented at the Mural Arts Institute about collaborating with the community to see what works for them before you put something up that you intend well. But so that's a visual kind of version of this, and we're talking about structurally and in all kinds of ways that whenever we're working with communities, they need to be experts and not just us, right, Chloe?
Thank you. I just want to add to that, I think too, they're starting with asking the community what is important to them and what will enable them to continue to flourish in the ways that are important, what does flourishing look like to them?
Yeah.
Right. And I think that
Yeah.
often we start with our own assumptions of what flourishing looks like, of what success looks like, rather than giving the community members, the individuals, the direct agency to define that for themselves and to share what their needs are and their desires are. I just want to kind of note, while the SACS program primarily supports the arts at Penn, we have over this past year through a grant from the William Penn Foundation been engaging in a project with the Paul Robeson House Museum in West Philadelphia. And the goal of that grant is to support an arts council in West Philadelphia, made up of members of the West Philadelphia community or people who are deeply connected to the West Philadelphia community, to one, establish a grants program that will give grants directly to West Philadelphia community members, and also support an artist residency program for West Philadelphia artists. And the premise of this project is really to give the West Philadelphia community members voice in saying what matters to them and what are the ways they want to be supported. And I think that is really, I think that's really important. And I think that, in just coming from a large institutions often assume that they know what is right and what is best. And, I think that it's important to kind of shift that power dynamic.
Yeah, that's really well said, Chloe. So one of my greatest fears in working with flourishing positive psychology, I have a 13-year-old son. And one of my greatest fears is that we'll get the world all fixed. And he will say to me, no, thanks. I don't want that world that you worked so hard to make for me, right? Now, I don't think we're gonna get the world all fixed in 8 years, but my point is, as parents, as educators, as people working in communities, we oftentimes think, well, if we can just get this figured out or fixed or something, then everything will be fine. And it turns out it's important to listen to what folks in the community want. Part of what I think people in communities want universally, I would say, is autonomy, agency, something to do. Like, we're not gonna get everything figured out and then everything is perfect. We're human beings. Human beings are made to have problems to work on. Right? That's what, think about, this is the problem with retirement for people who retire and wanna go to a beach someplace. Oftentimes it doesn't work out so well for them because there's not like meaning and something to do. So I think that
Speak for yourself.
I'll let you know.
Sounds pretty good.
But the point is that we need to think about a world in which there's always something to do, right? And so people can't merely be done unto. They need to be able to feel, and it's in the moment, but also in the ongoing future. We need, and this is, we just need to have those kinds of opportunities. So I want to ask one more question and then we'll open it up to all of you. And this question, I think I'm hearing the panel talk about boundaries as kind of being in the process of being broken down or reshifted, boundaries between disciplines, boundaries, you know, where is art actually? It's not just in the art department, it's different places, resources, you know, what does a resource look like? And so maybe traditionally it's one thing, but we're, and so I guess that's my question is, as these, and post-pandemic, we're still kind of trying to get things figured out, what, you know, what domains are coming back, what are still struck. So in this kind of milieu of shifting boundaries, what thoughts do each of you have about this question of resources? Right, and so certainly including funding, but not only funding. What do you see as possibilities? What do you see as maybe trajectories? What do you see as future directions in which those of us here in this room are trying to find the resources that we need to continue our work? Where should we be looking?
Reminded of a conversation we were just having for the break. I'm looking at you, Susan. In terms of, you know, just the work that we're talking about only take place in places where there is universal healthcare. You know, is it only possible in the NHS, or can we do something, you know, like hospital rooms, for example, here, and see a program like that really thrive in the US? And it's a complicated question to answer. And I think all of us have had our personal encounters with trying to navigate healthcare systems here, and also are aware to different degrees of efforts to try to resource well-being. And well-being itself, of course, is a multi-trillion-dollar industry that's being invested in, not necessarily with health equity in mind. I'm thinking about the ways in which we go about resourcing our labs. So I'll answer just from that space, and thinking about the public-private partnerships that we have been working on in order to make this happen. To find companies, organizations with shared aims who want to invest in this, and who don't want to invest in it with too much of a hold of control over what we're doing and how we're doing it, but really do believe in the social mission and values that we're espousing. And there's an interesting set of relationships that we've been experimenting with for the last couple of years, involving the role of artists in contributing back into resourcing health and well-being, even as we're talking. So it's a different way of thinking about the relationship between arts and health. So a couple of years ago, my colleague Stephen Stapleton, who's another co-director of the lab, developed a relationship with Christie's and had a group of artists who were interested in donating their artwork to the lab via Christie's auctions. Christie's auctioned it for arts and health for a WHO, you know, arts and health initiative, And then that money went into the lab to resource our research, right? And it also went back directly to artists for their arts and health work. And it raised 750,000 in 1 year. So we're thinking maybe there's something to that and maybe we'll keep that up. But we had to think about other streams, other ways of going about it.
Love it.
No, I'm just kidding. I actually, a few thoughts on that. One is, our chairs sometimes, Dr. Jackson has spoken sometimes, and I don't think this is flippant at all, said, the NEA can be a concierge desk for other federal agencies. And what that means is we have resources through our grants, through our projects, through other, means to help support the missions of other federal agencies. And this is just government to government, at the federal level alone for now. But, and to do that, and we've done that with surveys, for example, I've explained how we've collected all kinds of data because it's in other people's surveys and we integrate arts with their area of interest because they find it valuable as well. And then we get better data that way. But it's not just research, it's across the board. So I think recognizing the NEA is a point at the federal, a flashpoint at the federal government that you can think about as a gateway to other resources within the federal government, and we can help to connect people to other resources. Something I really push for. Also, state and regional and local arts organization agencies, which often get granted money from us, but also get state legislated money and all kinds of other sources. And think of them as partners in research. And I'd love to see more hybrid, researchers paired with arts organizations or artists. And lastly, I don't have an answer for this, but just to say that, a lot of times projects I was talking about, maybe some of you are very intentional, like they're trying to move the needle in some way on health or well-being through the arts. But let's remember, I don't need to tell you all, but artists themselves and creative workers and arts, independent of whether they're trying to self-consciously aspire to improve public good, I think all this will make us realize, all this great work that's being done will make us realize that the arts themselves and artists and their health, for that matter, need to be supported equally. And, and just as we look at healthcare workers and burnout rates for healthcare workers, we should attend to arts and cultural workers to some degree in a similar way. So I love that.
I think one of the things the pandemic showed us is, it raised this issue of essential work and what constitutes essential work, who is an essential worker. And I would like to see the arts and artists included in that calculus too. I think the arts are essential and cultural work is essential work. So yes, I agree completely. I think at the Pew Center, we have project grants. That's sort of our signature grant making program is in addition to our artist fellowships, but we also offer what is called capacity building support for artists and organizations, in which that's really a year-round discretionary initiative in which we look at we have these long-standing relationships with organizations in the region. And one of the benefits of that is that we can, we have time to develop deeper relationships and engagements. And that can be somewhat personal, or they can just be beyond the actual project at hand. So we can convene colleagues together to share conversations and talk about issues. We just organized a workshop around crisis communications for organizations, how to get ahead of the game before something happens. And it was a way to bring comms people together to have discrete conversations together with some experts in the room who could share some case study experience. We sometimes will, there's travel opportunities, there's thinking partnerships in which we might connect a practitioner with someone that they might just want to have a conversation with to ideate about a nascent project idea they might have, or a line of inquiry that they want to explore further. So it's, it's part coach, part cheerleader, part colleague, in a way to kind of spark ideation. And that happens year round. So it's a way to, we think about capacity building as a way to support organizations beyond the timeline of our grant cycle in particularly since ideas don't happen in a linear way. They take time to incubate, and we want to respect and honor that too.
I think I'll talk a little bit about our process of the SACS program. We start most of our work with applicants with a conversation. We invite people to come and talk to us about their ideas. And I think that's really valuable for a few reasons. One, it makes us aware of what our community is doing and what their needs are. And so through those conversations, and we'll have hundreds of them, each grant cycle, we really kind of can get the temperature of like what's happening in the arts humanities at Penn and in our community. And so from that, we can understand different ways that we can support our community through our grants and through other means. We also, we serve also as, we refer to ourselves as a bit of a matchmaker, and that we through those conversations, we'll learn that, this person is focusing on, art in the health system over here, and then someone over here is doing similar work, and they're not aware of each other, and they're not in dialogue. And so from our kind of central position, we're a Probostio Center at Penn, we're able to cultivate relationships and forge connections across all of Penn's 12 schools. And that's really the goal, is that we're really creating more of a web, I guess, of a network of the arts and humanities at Penn, and kind of drawing each other closer and really cultivating a strong community. And I think in doing that, we're able to then figure out what the needs of our community are and how we can better support our community. And I guess I'll just add that too, through our grants process, we also share feedback with our applicants, and that feedback is often used to either reapply to us if an applicant is not successful the first time, or to apply to other, for other support, to other foundations, to other grant making bodies. And that's really the goal. And that's why we call ourselves a support system, because we're not just a grant maker. That's not our intent. Our intent is really to figure out the ways that we can support our community, however they need us to support.
Fantastic, great points, both. Thank you. I'm hopeful that this group may be able to function in kind of a similar way to what you were talking about, Sachs, in terms of helping people to connect across, similar work that's being done, that may be able to help provide internal resources amongst us. That we were just talking about this during a break, that may allow us, without necessarily having more money into the system, we can be more effective in what we're doing by collaborating more effectively and more efficiently. So what questions do you folks have? Albert?
I want to speak a little bit from the perspective of an artist, like thinking about funding and the ecosystem, thinking about the purpose of this particular conference, which I think is fantastic. So thanks so much to James for organizing it. I don't know a single artist who starts an artwork or initiates an artwork with the thought, I want to increase well-being. That might be a happy byproduct of art or of an artwork, but it's never its explicit purpose. And as a matter of fact, utilitarian art, like art that is merely utilitarian, such as Gebrauchsmusik, as it's called, just something that's done, created only for a specific purpose that is other than art itself, actually devalues art in so many cases. So from a funding perspective, and even from the perspective of flourishing, then I think we need to still keep our eye on the fact that artists create art for art's sake. That's the whole point. So we shouldn't lose sight of the purpose of art, and it's worth certainly paying attention to art for art's sake, and a byproduct of that might actually be, hey, it's actually good for us, and we might even flourish as a result, and maybe our neighborhood, our society, our culture might receive benefit from it. But it's all about art.
Thanks, Al. Let me just respond quickly, if I might, just to begin. So yeah, we don't want positive propaganda.
Exactly.
Right, where there's this kind of shallow kind of requirements that people, this kind of toxic positivity or these kinds of things, right? And in fact, at the beginning of the work that we were doing, I had a meeting with the then director, Wendy Rao, of the Institute for Contemporary Art here, and she said, focus not on making positive works of art, but focus on how people can engage with art in a positive kind of way. So I think I very much agree with your point. And I think there's also, from my perspective, there's another side of it, which I'd love to hear other folks' thought. That phrase, art for art's sake, I've never met Art. I don't know if he's a tall guy or a short guy, or like what he, no, and in all seriousness, why do we do art? Like, I agree with you that we typically don't set out to say, well, let me do art because blah, blah, blah. But if art were something that were inherently damaging to us and inherently damaging to others, bad for us and awful, my guess is that less art would be done. So I think that without necessarily intending to do something that's in the domain of well-being, when art is engaged in, there's often a sense of flow. There's often a sense of immersion in the work. There's often a sense of insight. There's often a sense of expression. And I think what those of us who are researchers in this domain are trying to do is not to measure art. Like, I don't even know what that means, right? Oh, it's 3 feet by 2, like that doesn't make any sense in terms of what we're talking about. But I think what we're trying to do is to measure the intrinsic benefits of art. And it gets tricky because then if an artist knows, oh, I've read Csikszentmihalyi, I know about flow, I can get immersed and this could be really great. Then is an artist then doing art for the purpose of that? Or is that a byproduct? So I think it gets a little bit tricky, but I think the point that I would completely agree with you is we don't want this to turn into a shallow kind of utilitarianism. And I think we want to learn more and more and more about how engagement with art as an artist, as an appreciator, as a viewer of art, listener engagement and so forth, can actually have these intrinsic benefits for ourselves, for our communities. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I think artists create art for beauty and or meaning. Now, they're not always the same thing, so there are a lot of different types of art. And we could have a whole discussion about a lot of interesting things. I'd love to, it'd be amazing the discussion you can have here. But yeah, so I can forgive me. I'm too jet lagged still, but I think artists create art for beauty and or meaning. I think that is the point. And I would know the other point actually is that a lot of really good artworks are not quote unquote positive. As a matter of fact, many of them are negative. And partly because I think art can confront us with maybe parts of ourselves that we don't otherwise engage with. And that's what makes them so meaningful and so powerful. But it's not necessarily positive.
Well, I think that's why it's important to have a capacious definition of what we mean by the positive. So what I referred to earlier as the indirectly positive and the directly positive. So I see pulling weeds in a garden. In some senses, it's a negative process, but I see it as a very positive outcome, right? And so these kinds of artworks that confront us, just like a medicine might confront us, and it might not be, an appendectomy is not fun, but in the long run, it's a healthy kind of. Sunil, oh, sorry, yeah.
Oh, it's okay. I mean, I think that, I thank you for your question and your comments. And I think that, art, and there's so many different forms of art making, right? There's also, there's socially driven art, there's community developed art, there's, and so I think that, art can function in very different ways. And I think it can serve very different means. And I think that, I think that it's important to also keep in mind that art can be a site for discussion, art can be a space for processing ideas. And so even if it's not quote unquote kind of positive, or the well-being isn't at its center, that's what it can foster, right? It can foster opportunities for care and for well-being. And I think that a lot of what we're seeing, Kelly, you talked a lot of it about kind of the state of artists and arts organizations post-pandemic and post-2020. I mean, I think we're seeing a lot of language in our grants around care, about art being a bomb, BALM, about art being an opportunity for communities that have felt marginalized to come together and to share in their experiences, to care for one another. And so I think that art can function in many different ways and serve many different purposes. And that's what's really wonderful about it, right? That it, and why it's so important to our well-being and to our flourishing.
I think that this raises all kinds of different issues to address, and I think that it's possible in some of the projects we've heard about to have very high aesthetic accomplishment and very high social efficacy, and that weave and that weft can coexist. And in fact, in many projects that I've examined it in the collaboratives I've looked at, when there is high aesthetic accomplishment, that can transfer over to the well-being benefits that somebody derives as well. There's a flip side to this too, in the sense, or maybe not a flip side, but another piece to this, which has to do with insights coming out of performing arts medicine, where you have artists who engage in their work day in and day out and are very skilled and trained in it, but they are not the ones deriving the benefit from it, simply because that's the way that they're approaching it, right? And so when we engage in the research, we are thinking about modes of engagement, participating, learning through, creating, all the different ways in which we engage with the arts. And if you're training in it as your profession, you may experience a different relationship to it than somebody who maybe doesn't. They're not trained in it, but they are coming to it a bit like in the encounter you described, and it's opening up some new possibility for them. Which challenges the first thing I said. Sometimes it's not only about the high aesthetic accomplishment, because I think about psychodrama groups that I've led where it's not with actors, but they're asked to imagine somebody and to step into a role, and it's transformative. And that's it.
I think there's, oh, sorry, some other people, but I just quickly was saying that I think there are different categories and ways we think about this. And I think that, you know, I just revel in the fact, I like to think the arts are boundless and that they're uncontainable, really. But nevertheless, the paradox is, as researchers, you're trying to measure a particular aspect of it. But you'll have to have the same humility that we have with community engagement stuff to know that we're never going to get to the complete story. But at least we can, there are some effects, let's say, that occur with the arts that we're interested in knowing. And then perhaps some practitioners, maybe not the artists themselves, can use that for curating, for programming, for delivery of programs, rather than put the burden on the artists.
Great, thank you. Let's go to another question.
Oh, so thank you all so much. I was very interested and pleased that towards the end, you started kind of talking a little bit about artwork and labor, because that's such a big issue in our cultural institutions these days. And I know as someone who was a lead organizer at the PMA just down the street, like, and now finds myself at Penn, like, I'm very interested in thinking about the ways in which these institutions can not only support our communities, but support the workers who do this work in our communities. And so I'm curious, like, y'all are in a very different position than me and have eyes coming at it from a different perspective than me as someone who's like working in education in a museum. I'm curious, like, what your thoughts are and like ways that maybe our institutions could change for the better, and what that might look like in your opinions.
Well, one thing I've been really seeing in the work that we support are organizations being much more expressive about their boundaries and their capacity, and that both of those are limited, right? So we only have so much time and money, and our staffs are only so big. So, you know, one of the prompts in our grant making is, you know, I would say it used to be like, what's your, you know, your big new idea, you know, like what's your game-changing transformative project you want to do? Now it's, you know, because there are, you know, our resources are substantial. So it's kind of, you know, it was a scale thing, but now I'd say it's more, okay, what feels like the right project for your organization at this time, and how can you do it ethically, thoughtfully, and with care, both for your audiences, you know, for whom the work is for, and also for those that are doing the work internally, you know. And so I've seen that show up in budgets. We support childcare in budgets. We support, you know, time for research and development, for refreshments and people coming together, because, you know, connecting over food is a huge part of doing the work, right? That's something that we all share and enjoy. And also just thinking about paying people better for their work. So whenever there are project collaborators, making sure that that everyone is paid, from project directors and, project delimited positions to also community advisors that are also participating in the work, that if they're being solicited for their opinions or their ideas, that everyone's getting paid. It's really important. And so I think, and we like to say, and we talk a lot about how budgets and numbers really tell a story. And so do the ethics and values that are expressed in the narrative, do they show up in, where the book goes as well?
Let's go, yeah.
I have a follow-up question to that, and I really appreciate, Kelly, that you guys are thinking about paying for artists and arts administrators' care. It's a conversation. I have a small group of arts leaders that we meet once a month, and it's where the conversation goes almost every single time we meet, is about the time and space it takes to recover and from the project that is both about the artistry and the connection to the community. Or simply a project that is about the person's own trauma or experience. So my question is, how do we help the artists and the arts organizations get off the funding hamster wheel? Because I think that that's also a big piece of this. They are like, oh, we have to get this done because Pew is looking for a report and, and we have to get the next grant in. And so I see that they want to pull back, they want to set those boundaries, and they're also terrified because they're afraid of losing the funding.
I have thoughts, but I want to make sure my colleagues.
Go for it. If you have thoughts, let's hear them.
Prerequisite.
Well, since we got called out, so I think saying no is part of that calculus where that's possible. So we have organizations that we work with that just set a cycle out. They're like, we don't have it in us right now. We need to just regroup and take care of ourselves, and we'll talk again in the future. So that's an option. That's a privileged option, perhaps, but that is something that's possible. I think it's a tricky one. I mean, also the other thing that's happening in philanthropy is that funders' strategic priorities are shifting. And so the dollars are going, they're being allocated in different ways now. And so that is having a deep impact on organizations in terms of how they can think about meeting their operating budgets. So there's a pivoting that's happening at the foundation end that has direct impact on the provider, IDeater, producer's end. And so that's something that I don't know, how to thread that needle, but I know that that's a serious concern in the cultural ecology. I think there's a big, and then I'll stop talking. There's also a really big conversation happening in philanthropy around trust-based philanthropy and general operating support, and being able to support full organizational wellness beyond the transactional project at hand. So looking at longer timelines, longer lead times, like where can we give oxygen and space to organizations to do their work, to do their best work, take care of their staffs and their communities, and just trust them that they know best what they need to do that.
I didn't mean to call you out. I just want to hear from anybody else who is thinking about how they're changing the curriculum.
Sounded like a Sunil question.
Well, we are bound by, we do project specific support, and I think we learned, especially during the pandemic, how important the flexibility of unrestricted kind of grants and operating support is. I will say with the labs program, if I can harken back to that for a moment, we tried to have it, obviously it's not operating support, but the idea is to do multi-year funding so that there could be a track for things to happen. So I think that's something that the NEA is looking at in general. Not this isn't news or anything, but we're trying to understand the value proposition of doing multi-year kinds of awards versus one-off awards, so that it could give a breather to organizations that are in that round and have, they've got the grant or they haven't, but then maybe there's some lag time, and it does definitely put all these I mean, I don't know enough about the world, and I try to educate myself about the world of philanthropy in terms of donors versus earned income sources and how nonprofits stay afloat if they're a nonprofit. But I think there's some more research to be done or to be illuminated about the mix of earned and contributed income and how that's changed since the pandemic. Particularly as you've said, since sources are withering, but also because the types of funding that's traditionally going to quote arts is from foundations is now often in another bucket of work. And you have to, it's eligible, but it's not labeled as arts, you know, so to speak. So it's requiring organizations to bring a different skill set sometimes, certainly in the grant writing, but maybe even in partnering to do a project. And so the partnership, the nimbleness of having partnerships, I think is really important. So you can, hate the word now, I think we all do, pivot to be competitive for those kind of opportunities.
But Sunil, I just want to speak with gratitude from the position of somebody who has benefited from your approach with the research labs. You know, when you're playing the long game, just trying one thing and trying something else and then trying something else isn't necessarily the way to get to the sustainable growth. I know that for us, just having the time to be able to try something and then learn from that and then say, okay, what went really well about that? What didn't go so well about it? How can we tweak that? I think in the long run advances the work more than, you know, team A gets all assembled, gets everything, you know, gets something and then it's done. And then they don't pass on their learning necessarily. You write up a paper, but you have a lot more learning than what came out of that paper, right? So I think that's a really important perspective and we really certainly appreciate it. So I think we have time maybe for one more question.
Yeah, and it may not be enough time for it. But your question about getting it all done, making sure the world is 100% perfect, what do we do after that? Makes me wonder if we're looking through the telescope at the wrong way, or the wrong end of the telescope. I had a conversation with a friend, and basically I said, well, what are we doing this for? Why are we working so hard? Why are we putting our kids through college? Why are we doing this and that? And he said, what else if not for the culture? What else if not for art? And what does it say about us as a culture, as a society, if we don't place value on art? And not just the people who do art, but the people who appreciate or absorb art, the audience. Is there enough focus on the audience and the audience's appreciation of what is around them and how it affects them socially, how it affects the entire society?
We may be moving more and more into a situation where we'll be able to or be required to answer that question. Just thinking about some of the effects of artificial intelligence. And if some of those effects come true, that many people think it will, this is going to revolutionize what's required work-wise. And so we can't, you know, so many of us depend for our meaning, our well-being, our relationships, all those kinds of things on our work lives. And if work becomes scarcer, more, you know, the kinds of work that we're used to are no longer there, then we're going to have to figure out, you know, Sunil thinks he's going to be fine in retirement. I think he's going to have to, you know, go back to his ukulele and play a lot, and, take up more of the, you know, the Magic Gardens medallion, like you get something. You're right, because just kind of like, oh, we made it, great. Let's, you know, put up our feet and
What kind of society do you have? How healthy is your society?
Right.
What number of arts do you have?
Right.
How many people participate in that?
Right.
One way or another.
Yeah.
And if we don't, aren't we headed for a Hobbesian society?
So we measure that, we try to measure that stuff, just put your finger on it. The issue is, I think, in the public consciousness and certainly among policymakers, funders, connecting that with you know, the relationship for some kind of external outcome, which they're seeking, you know, and I'm not saying we need to do that, but I would think measuring that is for its own sake valuable and important. And to some people, some countries it is, you know, they'll proudly say, I mean, this is the number of performances, or this is the, you know, this is the degree of participation in this country, and that's on par with some other indicators of that nation's well-being. And we would like to see that happen, and we're trying to, certainly try to make that happen at the federal level if we can. But certainly in communities, I think it's important to consider those kinds of indicators as health indicators rather than purely sectoral indicators.
And I'm sorry, the back row, I don't know your name. What,
Oh,
do you want to chime in? Kristen,
yeah, I
chime
think
in.
it's a related thought.
Right.
I've been sitting here today trying to step out and find a slightly different paradigm. I mean, because, for example, like the art for art's sake, that's one cultural kind of paradigm or notion, or even the, why do we do this? We are trying to solve an epidemic of loneliness, for example, which I think is tricky. An epidemic, I used to work for a history of science museum. I mean, epidemic is coming out of a very particular Western diagnostic tradition of medicine. So the question is, and I think you were trying to get there when you're talking about like, we always want something to do rather than like we solve it and we're done. So what is it that we are after? And as you're saying, we do it for the art. I actually wonder if the paradigm has to go outside of art or outside of medicine. And I'm thinking to a talk that I heard here with the environmental humanities program. There was a political philosopher who's indigenous, whose name is Kyle Powys White. And he writes about collective continuance. And when he's writing about it, he's talking about climate change. And he really resists the notion of crisis as a paradigm to say, he says, and I am not indigenous, but when he says, my people have always been in crisis. We have always had forced migrations. We have always faced different climates, different foods, different whatever. And, this is the next one. But what he's after when he analyzes climate change is he doesn't look at, he says, most Western folks who are thinking about, climate change are saying like, what's the number of carbon? What's the diagnostic way? And he looks at collective continuance and the presence or lack of, because if you do not have access to salmon, then you lose the relationships built around the ritual of the catching of the salmon. You lose the carvings that are made in relation to the imagery of the salmon or the making of the nets, etc. So I think that when we're talking about, studies for coming to consensus over looking at imagery, or which I would like to see applied in couples therapy, by the way. But let's talk about us. Let's talk about this thing, but let's practice what it is to come to consensus. But anyway, I think that maybe, and I don't want to appropriate an idea that should not, be taken out of the context that White is talking about it in. But this collective continuance, I guess I feel like is speaking to me with more of a notion of what we are after in a holistic sense, whether it's economic, creative, health, etc., and a continuance of relatedness. I also, as a last closing thought, I am really troubled by the notion of the epidemic of loneliness, because I question, is that about loneliness or is that about the way we think of being alone? Like, I don't assume that someone who is alone is lonely anyway, but my point is, like, I think we are focusing here on what is relatedness, whether it's with self, with others, with the work of art, through slow seeing, etc. And how do we perpetuate that and grow a more kind of connected and healthy culture? And that's more than enough. Thank you.
So thank you, Christy. I don't think we could have said it better ourselves. We'll just have Christine, you have the final word.
My thinking about this is, I don't know how you disaggregate identity from culture. And for some of us, I never knew who I was if it wasn't for the people in my circle. Music, dance, literature, my earliest memories are memories of that. And as one of the earlier commentators was talking about the monetary issue, well, my husband and I, in your comment about indigenous folks, was thinking about in slavery, we had Negro spirituals, we had the blues come from gourds from Africa. Some of the oldest music, dance traditions in our country, there was no money. But this is a gathering of people coming together. It's identity. They were bringing their culture and their music, food, dance. You see the same thing in indigenous cultures. And it is so intertwined. Some of the oldest artifacts we have on the face of the earth are indeed artistic artifacts. And so I don't see any separation between identity and culture. I think it is part of who we are. And I think that some of the lack of ability to express that, you know, when we start talking about loneliness and a whole host of other things, but I don't see how you can disaggregate them, because in some ways I see no self without art for so many cultures and communities in our world.
Well, thank you. We ended on a couple of really nice observations and insightful provocations. Thank you so much to our panel.